A millionaire businessman was walking hastily through the busy city streets, carrying a briefcase full of cash, when he tripped on a crack in the asphalt and fell awkwardly, causing the briefcase to burst open and scatter hundreds of bills across the dirty ground. An 8-year-old girl, who had been watching from a distance, quickly gathered all the scattered money and ran desperately after him, shouting to call his attention. He completely ignored her, automatically assuming she wanted to beg, until she finally caught up to him and said with a trembling voice, "Sir, your money fell," when he turned around in surprise and saw that small, dirty, ragged figure honestly offering back all the money that could have changed her life forever. Something in his frozen heart began to melt for the first time in decades. What he would discover about the life of this extraordinarily brave girl would transform him in ways he never thought possible. The heat was a personal enemy to Arthur Blackwell, a sticky, insolent enemy that clung to the expensive fabric of his Italian suit, mocking his attempt to maintain composure amidst the urban chaos. The asphalt steamed, releasing waves of vapor that distorted the view, transforming the concrete landscape into a feverish mirage. For Arthur, New York City was not a home, but an arena he dominated, where every skyscraper was a monument to his ambition and every person a piece on his business chessboard. He had just closed a deal that would add another few million to his already vast fortune. A transaction done in cash, a whim of his to feel the tangible weight of victory. Inside the leather briefcase he held firmly rested stacks of $100 bills that represented more than most people would see in a lifetime. It was power. It was security. It was the wall that separated him from the grimy, desperate world that surrounded him. He walked with the haste of someone who believed that time was quite literally money. Every step was calculated, every glance a risk assessment. He saw the humanity around him not as a collective of souls, but as a sea of needs and weaknesses. Street vendors, weary mothers, young people with headphones, they were all background noise, irrelevant to the symphony of his success. His mistrust was a second skin. He always assumed the worst of people, a philosophy that, in his mind, had protected him from fraud and elevated him to the top of the financial world. Coldness was not a flaw. It was a tool, the sharpest in his arsenal. But inside the ice palace of his heart, a vast and silent loneliness echoed, a sound he muffled with the rustle of new bills and the glow of another successful investment. A moment of inattention, a misplaced foot on a treacherous crack in the pavement, and his universe of absolute control shattered. The world tilted violently. The smooth leather of the briefcase slipped from his sweaty fingers and he fell, his knee hitting the hot concrete hard. The sound of the briefcase latch breaking was a sharp snap, a prelude to disaster. The lid flew open and for a surreal moment the air turned green. Crisp, green $100 bills danced in the hot air and landed on the sidewalk soot like autumn leaves falling from an impossible tree. The flow of pedestrians stopped, their gazes of shock and greed fixed on the scene. The capital he so fiercely protected was now exposed, vulnerable, scattered in the filth for anyone to take. Panic, an emotion Arthur rarely allowed himself, rose in his throat. He propped himself up on his elbows, his face twisted in pain and fury, ready to scream, to threaten anyone who dared to approach. His eyes scanned the scene, his vision blurred by humiliation. That's when he saw her, a small, thin figure, emerging from the shadows of an alleyway like a spectre, a girl, perhaps no more than 8 years old, dressed in worn clothes, her face smudged with dirt. Her large, frightened eyes were fixed not on him, but on the fortune scattered around her. Arthur's blood ran cold. This was what he always expected, a vulture, the weakest and most desperate, ready to pick at the scraps. Before he could shout, before he could process the full humiliation of the situation, The girl darted forward, her small, nimble hands beginning to gather his money from the ground. An icy rage surged through Arthur's veins. He watched the girl's hands, small and fast, flying over the scattered $100 bills, and every movement was a stab to his wounded pride. Here was the confirmation of everything he had always believed. At the first opportunity, human weakness would reveal itself in its purest, most predatory form. He braced himself for the final act of this public humiliation. She would grab as much cash as she could carry and disappear back into the filthy alley she came from, leaving him crippled and robbed in plain sight. The scene unfolded in slow motion in his mind, a grotesque film he had directed with his own carelessness. He struggled to get up, his aching body protesting, his face red not just from the heat, but from shame. The surrounding crowd was a blur of curious and indifferent faces, silent witnesses to his literal and figurative fall. He didn't care about them, but about the girl. That small creature was the embodiment of his contempt for the world. But something was wrong with his cynical script. The girl wasn't stuffing the bills into her pockets. With surprising concentration, she stacked them, one on top of the other, smoothing out the crumpled ones. Her actions were not those of a furtive thief, but of someone tidying up a mess. When the last bill was collected from the dirty pavement, she didn't run for the alley. She turned. Her large eyes met his, and to Arthur's shock, she began to run toward him, the stack of money held securely in both hands. What did she want? To mock him, to demand a reward. He tensed, his suspicion returning with full force, an armor hastily reassembling around his heart. She approached, the sound of her small, quick footsteps muffled by the traffic noise. Her mouth opened, and a desperate, childish cry cut through the air. "Mister, wait, your money." The words hit him like stones. Mister, a word of respect, your money. A declaration of ownership he never expected to hear. She stopped a few feet from him, breathless, her small chest rising and falling rapidly. She held out her hands, offering him what was his, the stack of bills. A small fortune that could have transformed her life and her family's forever was there, intact. Not a single bill was missing. Arthur looked from the recovered capital to the girl's face. It was dirty, yes, and her hair was matted. But her eyes were clear. With an honesty so pure and unwavering, it seemed to burn through every layer of his arrogance. For the first time in years, perhaps in his entire adult life, Arthur Blackwell was speechless. The entire world seemed to fall silent. The heat, the traffic, the pain in his knee, it all vanished. There was only him and this child, an abyss of wealth and power between them, bridged by an act of integrity that defied all his logic. A wave of contradictory emotions washed over him, shame for his hasty judgment, a flicker of admiration, and most terrifying of all, a pang of connection. It was a dangerous, vulnerable feeling. He needed to escape. With a brusque movement, he snatched the money from her hand, almost rudely, and stuffed it back into the broken briefcase. His brain screamed at him to leave, to return to the safety of his glass and steel office. But he couldn't, not completely. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a single $100 bill, and without looking her in the eye, pushed the money into her small hand. "Take this, for you," he muttered, his voice hoarse. Before she could react, before he could see gratitude or confusion on her face, he turned and limped away as fast as he could, fleeing not from the scene, but from the disconcerting warmth kindling in his chest. The next day, a morbid curiosity drew him back to that neighborhood. He needed to prove to himself that she was like everyone else, that she would have spent the money on foolish things. And then he saw her, huddled in the doorway of a bakery. She wasn't holding candy or toys. She was holding a piece of cardboard with the word "food" scrawled on it, and the money he had given her was nowhere in sight. The night had been a torment for Arthur. Sleep, usually an orderly and dreamless refuge, had turned into a battlefield. The image of the girl, with her honest eyes and dirty hands holding out his fortune, haunted him. He awoke to the echo of his own harsh words and the memory of his cowardly escape. It was an irritating feeling, an anomaly in his meticulously controlled life. Why did she bother him so much? To prove to himself that his cynical worldview was still intact, to erase that stain of vulnerability, he found himself driving his luxury car back to the same grey streets the following afternoon. He convinced himself it was a matter of logic. He would find her in a new dress, eating sweets, and the natural order of the universe, where everyone acts out of self-interest, would be restored. He needed to see the proof that his $100 gesture had been just an investment in selfishness, like any other. Money, after all, corrupted, and poverty, he believed, was the most fertile ground for that corruption. He parked several blocks away, feeling ridiculous in his impeccable suit, a predator outside his natural habitat. He walked along the cracked sidewalks, his heart pounding with an anxiety he didn't recognize. And then he saw her, not in a toy store or an ice cream parlor, but huddled in the doorway of a bakery from which the smell of fresh bread emanated. She seemed even smaller and more fragile than the day before. In her hands, she held no purchases, no trophy of her new wealth. She held a piece of cardboard with a single word scrawled in charcoal: food. The sight was a punch to Arthur's gut. His fortress of cynicism trembled. It made no sense. He marched up to her, the shadow of his tall frame covering her completely. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. "I gave you money. Enough money." The girl, whose name was Leah, looked up, not with fear, but with a weariness that didn't belong to an 8-year-old. "Hello, mister," she said softly. "The money's gone." "Gone?" Arthur scoffed, incredulous. "How is it gone? What did you buy?" He expected a confession of waste, a story of candy and whims. Her answer, however, disarmed him completely. "I bought milk for Leo," she said, with the simplicity of someone stating an undeniable fact. "The doctor said he needs the strong kind, and I bought 2 blankets. The nights are getting cold, and Grandma gets so cold." Arthur was paralyzed. The words stuck in his throat. Milk, blankets, not for herself, for a sick brother and a frail grandmother. The $100 bill, which to him was pocket change, a trifle from his daily cash flow, had been transformed not into luxury, but into survival, into care, into love. He looked at her empty hands, at the sign asking for food, and the truth hit him with the force of a freight train. $100 wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. The shame he felt was overwhelming, burning his face more than the afternoon sun. He, the multimillionaire, the master of assets and liabilities, had miscalculated the cost of human dignity. "Who are Leo and your grandmother?" he managed to ask, his voice now a whisper. "Leo's my little brother. He's 5. He's sick," Leah explained, her eyes filling with a deep worry. "He coughs a lot and has a fever. And Grandma takes care of us, but she's not doing so well either. Her legs hurt, and she's tired all the time." A new layer of desperation revealed itself, and Arthur felt himself sinking into it. This wasn't just a hungry girl. It was an entire family on the brink of an abyss, and this child was trying to hold them all together with her own 2 hands. He felt like a fool, an intruder in a world of real suffering he only observed from his ivory tower. He looked at the bakery, at the people inside buying their bread and pastries, ignoring the small figure at the door. He was one of them. Until now, a chill ran through him, despite the heat. The problem was much bigger, much deeper than he had imagined. Leah looked up at him, a wrinkle of concern on her small brow. "The milk helped," she said, as if to reassure him. "But he woke up today breathing harder. Mister, his chest makes a funny whistling sound when he breathes in." Leah's words about the whistle in her brother's chest echoed in Arthur's mind all the way back to his office. The sound, described with terrifying, childish simplicity, seemed to have lodged in his own lungs, making it hard to breathe. He sat in his imported leather chair, overlooking the city that stretched below him like a map of his empire. But for the first time, the view brought him no satisfaction. It seemed empty, a landscape of glass and steel devoid of meaning. He thought of his own net worth, of the numbers dancing on his monitor screens, representing stocks, funds, and cryptocurrencies. A fortune unimaginable to most, but one that suddenly seemed obscenely useless in the face of the sound of a child struggling to breathe. He, who could move millions with a single phone call, felt utterly powerless. The reluctance to get involved was a powerful instinct, an alarm bell sounding in his head, warning him of the danger of crossing the line between anonymous charity and personal involvement. Yet, curiosity, now mixed with an unsettling dose of responsibility, gnawed at his resistance. He couldn't get the image of Leah, so small and so burdened, out of his head. How could a child take care of a sick brother and an elderly grandmother? Where were her parents? The questions assaulted him, breaking his concentration on his business. Profitability reports on his investments seemed trivial. The fluctuations of the stock market, which once dictated his mood, were now just background noise. Against his will, he found himself doing something he had never done before. He hired a private investigator, a discreet and efficient man he used to vet business partners. The task was simple and vague. Find out everything about the girl who stays near the bakery on Grant Avenue and about her family. Be discreet. He felt like a spy, an intruder, but the need to understand outweighed the discomfort. He needed facts, data, to turn this emotional drama into something he could analyze and perhaps dismiss. 2 days later, a manila envelope was on his desk. Arthur hesitated before opening it. Inside was a concise report and a few grainy photos taken from a distance. The words were cold and objective, but they painted a picture of desperation that left him breathless. Leah and her brother, Leonardo, were orphans. Their parents had died 2 years ago, victims of an accident the report didn't detail. Since then, they had lived with their maternal grandmother, Elvira, a 72-year-old woman with severe arthritis and a heart condition. They lived in a single room in the back of an abandoned building, with no running water and electricity jerry-rigged from a nearby pole. Elvira, despite her efforts, could barely care for herself. The responsibility of finding food, cleaning, and, above all, watching over little Leo fell almost entirely on Leah's shoulders. Leo suffered from acute bronchial asthma, and the precarious living conditions, the mold, the cold, the dust, aggravated his condition daily. The photos showed the cramped room, the makeshift bed where the boy seemed to sleep, and the bent figure of an old woman trying to sweep the floor. The most devastating image was of Leah, sitting beside her brother, placing a damp cloth on his forehead, her face a mask of concentration and love. Arthur felt a pressure in his chest, as if the air was being squeezed from his lungs. The reality was far worse than he had imagined. This wasn't a problem $100 could solve. This wasn't a problem he could ignore. Driven by an impulse he didn't understand, he went back that same night. He left his car a safe distance away and walked through the dark, quiet streets. He found the abandoned building, a concrete skeleton amidst the sleeping city. A single, dim light bulb glowed in a ground-floor window at the back. He approached stealthily, his heart pounding, feeling like an invader. Through the dirty window pane, he saw the scene the photo had only hinted at. Leah was awake, sitting on a wooden crate next to a mattress on the floor where her brother slept. The sound of Leo's cough was harsh and painful, echoing in the night silence. The grandmother slept in a chair, covered by one of the blankets he had indirectly provided. Leah, hearing her brother's cough, would lean over and whisper words of comfort, stroking his hair. She was alone in her vigil. And suddenly, Arthur also felt terribly alone, watching from the outside, separated from that act of pure love by a wall of glass and a lifetime of selfishness. Leo had a stronger coughing fit, and the sound that followed was the one Leah had described, a sharp, desperate wheeze, the sound of a small life fighting for every breath of air. The sharp wheeze from Leo's chest pierced the night in Arthur's heart. He pulled back from the window, his own breath caught in his throat, as if stealing air from the sick boy were a crime. The scene he had witnessed, Leah's solitary vigil, her brother's suffering, the grandmother's fragility, shattered the last of his indifference. He was no longer a distant observer. Knowledge had made him an accomplice to their suffering. He returned to his car, feeling a weight that none of his financial worries had ever caused. It wasn't the weight of a bad investment or a capital loss. It was the crushing weight of a human life at risk, a life he now knew how to save, but had no idea how to approach. The image of Leah whispering to her brother wouldn't leave him. The child's dedication was a force of nature, an act of altruism so pure, it made his entire pursuit of wealth seem meaningless and hollow. In the days that followed, a strange, secret routine began. Arthur, the reclusive billionaire, became a ghost on the edges of Leah's life. He watched her from afar, learning the rhythms of her precarious existence. He saw her in the mornings, searching through discarded boxes of fruits and vegetables behind a market, carefully choosing what was still edible. He watched as she carried water in buckets from a public fountain 2 blocks away, her thin arms tense under the weight. He saw her sitting on the sidewalk, no longer begging for food, but trying to sell little treasures she found in the trash. A colored glass bottle, a one-eyed doll, a toy car missing a wheel. Each object was polished and arranged with a touching care. He realized she was trying to earn her own money, a desperate effort to buy the medicine Leo needed. The girl's dignity was a wall as high as his own arrogance. One day, he followed her to a pharmacy. She went inside, clutching a few coins and crumpled bills. Arthur watched through the window. Leah showed the pharmacist a piece of paper, probably an old prescription. The man shook his head regretfully, pointed to the price on a box for an inhaler, and handed the paper back. Leah left the pharmacy with her shoulders slumped, defeat etched on her small face. She looked at the money in her hand, a pitiful amount, and her eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. That moment broke something inside Arthur. He saw himself, not as the successful businessman, but as the man who had given her $100 and abandoned her to her fate, believing he had done enough. He realized his one-time help was nothing. It was a bandage on a mortal wound. The family needed a real solution, a structure to pull them out of this cycle of despair. The first obstacle, he knew, would be Leah herself and her grandmother. They had a fierce pride, a refusal to accept charity that he now understood and, paradoxically, admired. At the same time, cracks were starting to appear in his own world. He began to pay more attention to his employees. He noticed the furtive glances, the conversations that stopped when he entered a room. For the first time, he questioned the loyalty that money bought. He overheard 2 of his junior executives talking in the elevator. "The man has no heart," one said. "He treats people like numbers on a spreadsheet. No wonder he has no one." The sentence hit him with the force of a punch. He had always prided himself on his reputation for being tough, ruthless. It was the foundation of his business empire. But now, the word "no one" echoed in the emptiness of his luxury penthouse. In the silence of his solitary dinners, he was Arthur Blackwell, the multimillionaire, the investment genius, and he was utterly despised by those who surrounded him. He was building a legacy of gold and loneliness. The disconnect he felt from his own team mirrored the disconnect he felt from humanity, and at the center of it all was Leah, a girl who, possessing nothing, seemed to understand the true value of things and people far better than he did. The identity crisis deepened. and he found himself trapped between two worlds, the one he had built and the one he was desperately beginning to desire but didn't know how to reach. The revelation of his employees' contempt was a bitter pill to swallow. Arthur had always measured his worth by the success of his business, by the admiration or fear he inspired in the corporate world. To realize that behind the sycophantic smiles, there was only disdain and isolation destabilized him. He looked at his team's faces during meetings and saw masks. He, the master of risk analysis, had never noticed his greatest liability, the bankruptcy of his human relationships. This painful insight made him even more obsessed with the small family living in the city's ruins. In Leah, Leo, and Elvira, he saw something his immense wealth couldn't buy, a genuine connection. Forged in the fire of adversity, Leah's care for her brother, the grandmother's resilience, these were assets of a kind that didn't appear on any balance sheet, but which he now understood to be true fortune. His secret surveillance continued, but with a new sense of urgency. He had to act. But how? The image of Leah leaving the pharmacy, defeated, haunted him. He thought of simply leaving an envelope of cash at their door, an anonymous donation. But he knew, instinctively, that this would be an insult to their pride. It would be using his dollars as a shield again, a way to solve the problem without getting involved, without getting his hands dirty with the complexity of real life. And he didn't want that anymore. He wanted, and this was the most terrifying discovery, to be part of the solution, not just to finance it. The family's dignity seemed an insurmountable obstacle. Elvira, he had learned through his investigator, was known in the neighborhood for refusing handouts, teaching her grandchildren that work, no matter how humble, was the only way. How could he offer help without wounding this fundamental principle? Leo's condition was visibly worsening. Arthur's nights were now interrupted not only by his own thoughts, but by anxiety for the boy. He found himself researching childhood asthma on his state-of-the-art computer, reading about treatments, about the dangers of damp and mold. Every symptom described in the medical articles made him think of the cold, damp room where the boy slept. The helplessness was maddening. He had the resources to build a hospital, yet he couldn't find a way to buy a simple inhaler for a child in need. The situation reached a breaking point on a rainy afternoon. Arthur was in his car, watching from a distance, when he saw Leah leave her home with a small bundle. She used a thin piece of plastic over her head to shield herself from the drizzle. Curious, he followed her. She didn't go to the market or the pharmacy. She walked to a busier part of town, where there were small pawn shops and second-hand stores. He watched her enter a small, dark shop. Minutes later, she came out, her face wet, but not just from the rain. Tears traced clean paths on her dirty cheeks. She was looking down at her own feet, now bare, muddy. She had sold her only shoes, a pair of old, worn-out sneakers. In her hand she clutched a few bills, far less than she needed for the medicine. The sight of her bare feet on the cold, wet pavement was the final straw. Arthur felt a surge of anger and despair, anger at the world, at injustice, but mostly anger at himself, at his hesitation, his cowardice. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Her sacrifice, so small and yet so immense, made his dilemma ridiculous. What good was all his wealth, all his power, if he couldn't stop a child from selling her shoes to try to save her brother's life? He knew he had to intervene, and it had to be now. Elvira's pride, his own reluctance, all of it became secondary. He started the car, the engine a roar of his own frustration. He didn't know what he would say or do, but he could no longer be a spectator. As he drove toward their home, a thought struck him. The grandmother was growing weaker. That morning, he had seen her try to get up from her chair and nearly fall. What would happen if she became completely bedridden? The entire responsibility, the weight of the world, would fall on Leah's shoulders. now with bare feet. The light rain turned into a downpour as Arthur drove, the drops hitting the windshield like frantic fingers. The city, washed and grey, seemed to reflect the turmoil in his soul. He parked the car a block from the abandoned building, the engine still running, as if the machine were as hesitant as he was. The plan, if you could call it that, was simple and desperate. He would go there, knock on the door, and offer help in a way they couldn't refuse. He imagined the scene, the suspicion in Elvira's eyes, the fear in Leah's. He was prepared for rejection, to be seen as an eccentric millionaire trying to ease his conscience. But the image of Leah's bare feet on the cold pavement was a fuel that burned hotter than his fear of involvement. He turned off the car, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the rain without an umbrella, letting the water soak his expensive suit. It was a penance, perhaps a baptism. He walked to the back of the building, the sound of his leather shoes splashing in the puddles. The dim light still shone in the window. He could hear, even through the wall and the sound of the rain, Leo's dry, persistent cough. He stopped before the worn wooden door, the peeling paint revealing the rotted wood beneath. He raised his hand to knock, but hesitated. It was in that moment of indecision that the door opened. It wasn't Elvira or Leah. It was a burly man with a rough face and dirty work clothes. He looked Arthur up and down with a mixture of surprise and contempt. "Lose something, pal," the man said, his voice a growl. Arthur took a step back, confused. I came to see the family that lives here," he stammered. The man laughed, an unpleasant sound. "The old lady and the kids, they got evicted. The owner's finally tearing this dump down." The words fell on Arthur like a physical blow. Evicted. He looked into the room over the man's shoulder. It was empty, completely empty. The mattress, the old chair, the few belongings the family had possessed were gone. Only damp stains on the walls and the smell of mold remained. "Where did they go?" Arthur asked, his voice rising in panic. "How should I know? The marshal gave them an hour to clear their junk out and scram. They're on the street, I guess, like all the rest." The man shrugged and slammed the door in Arthur's face, leaving him alone in the rain, staring at the rotten wood. The ground seemed to disappear from under his feet. He had waited, pondered, analyzed, and while he was lost in his rich man's dilemmas, the catastrophe had happened. They were on the street, in this torrential rain, with a sick grandmother and a boy who could barely breathe. A desperation unlike any he had ever felt seized him. It was a visceral feeling, a burning in his stomach. He ran back to the car, his soaked suit weighing him down. He started driving aimlessly through the streets, his eyes scanning every alley, every awning, every bus stop. He was looking for an elderly woman and two small children, a needle in a flooded haystack. The city, which was once his playground, was now a hostile labyrinth. Every passing minute was torture. The image of Leo, shivering with cold, his asthma triggered by the dampness, was a knife in his mind. The responsibility was his. If he had acted sooner, if he had overcome his fear and his pride, they would be safe. His hesitation hadn't just failed to help, it had condemned them. The multimillionaire, the man who could move markets, couldn't find a single family in his own city. He felt like the poorest, most useless man in the world. He pulled the car over, his forehead against the cold steering wheel, the sound of the rain and his own ragged breathing filling the silence. Just then, his phone rang. It was his private investigator. "Mr. Blackwell," said the calm voice on the other end. "I think I found something you need to know. Not about where they are now, but why they were evicted. It wasn't random. The building was purchased 2 weeks ago. The new owner demanded immediate vacancy." Arthur slowly raised his head, a terrible premonition forming in his chest. "Who bought the building?" he asked, his voice low and tense. The investigator paused before answering, and the reply that followed changed everything. "One of your own companies, sir, Blackwell Enterprises." The investigator's voice on the phone faded, but the words hung in the air, dense and poisonous. "One of your own companies, sir." The phrase repeated in Arthur's mind, a mocking echo amidst the sound of the rain. He, in his blind quest for expansion and profit, in his routine of signing papers and approving acquisitions without paying attention to insignificant details, had become the architect of the disaster he was now desperately trying to reverse. The irony was so cruel, so devastating, that for a moment he couldn't breathe. He wasn't just a reluctant bystander, he was the villain of the story. His fortune, the engine of his power, was the same force that had thrown a sick grandmother and 2 orphan children onto the street on a stormy night. That fortune, built on the premise of cold, impersonal logic, now revealed its monstrous face. Every dividend received, every stock that appreciated, seemed tainted by this injustice. A wave of nausea washed over him. He hung up the phone without a word and sped off, cutting through the rain with renewed fury. But now it was no longer a blind search. It was a hunt. He began to think like a strategist. Where would a homeless family seek shelter on a night like this? Public shelters. He grabbed his tablet, the high-speed connection, an absurd contrast to the misery he was searching for, and mapped out every shelter in the city. He called each one, his voice imperious and urgent, describing an elderly woman and 2 children. The answer was always the same: "We're full." We haven't seen anyone matching that description. The demand tonight is impossible because of the rain. The bureaucracy and indifference of the system mirrored his own attitude just hours before. Every no was a blow to his ego and his hope. The hours dragged on. The storm subsided, leaving behind cold air and glistening, empty streets. Arthur felt his eyes burning with exhaustion and frustration. He was about to give up, to admit defeat, when he remembered a detail from the investigator's report. Elvira attended a small neighborhood church, a humble place that offered soup to the needy on Wednesdays. It was a long shot, a stab in the dark, but it was all he had. He drove to the address, a working-class neighborhood he would never visit under normal circumstances. The church was small, with peeling paint and a single light on over a back door that led to a parish hall. He parked and approached on foot. Through a window, he saw them. They were sitting on a wooden bench, huddled together under a single blanket, one of the ones he had bought. Elvira seemed to have aged 10 years in a day, her face pale and exhausted. Leo was asleep in her lap, his breathing still ragged but less noisy, likely from the relief of being in a dry place. And Leah was awake. She wasn't crying. Her large eyes were fixed on some distant point, but they were not empty. In them was a fierce determination, a resilience that seemed impossible for a child her age. She was the sentinel, the guardian of her shattered family. Arthur stood there, outside in the cold, watching them. The relief of finding them was quickly replaced by a wave of shame, so profound it almost made him retreat. How could he approach them? What right did he have to show up here, the man whose empire had taken the little they had? He was the wolf approaching the lambs. No matter how well-intentioned he might feel now, he saw an elderly priest approach them, offering them a mug of something hot. Leah accepted with a grateful nod and helped her grandmother drink. The care in her gestures, the tenderness with which she adjusted the blanket over her brother, it was all a lesson in humanity that humbled him. He had to do something, but a direct approach was out of the question. He couldn't just walk in and say, "Hello, my company destroyed your home, but don't worry, I'll fix everything." It would break them. It would wound their pride in an irreparable way. He needed a new plan, a new strategy, one that positioned him not as an arrogant savior, but as an ally. He stepped back into the shadows, his brain working feverishly. He couldn't undo the damage he had caused, but maybe, just maybe, he could use his vast resources to build something new, something better. But to do that, He would need to earn their trust, and he knew that trust was an asset that, once lost, was nearly impossible to recover. He looked at them one last time before leaving. Leah, sensing something, turned her head toward the window, and for a second, her eyes seemed to meet his in the darkness. Leah's gaze, even if just an impression in the dark, haunted Arthur all night. He didn't sleep. Instead, he turned his luxury penthouse into a crisis command center. The problem was no longer abstract. It had names and faces. Leah, Leo, Elvira. He mobilized his personal assistant, waking her in the middle of the night with a series of urgent and unusual orders that left her bewildered. "Cancel all my meetings indefinitely," he said, his voice firm, "and find the best pediatric pulmonologist in the city. I want an appointment for tomorrow. No, for today. As soon as the office opens. I don't care what it costs or what his schedule is. Clear it." Next, he called a trusted real estate agent. "I need an apartment. Small, furnished, in a decent, safe neighborhood near a good hospital, and I need it yesterday." As the sun rose, staining the sky gray and pink, the machine of his power and wealth began to move, not to acquire more, but to repair. He knew the approach had to be delicate. He couldn't just show up at the church and hand them the keys to an apartment and a doctor's appointment. It would be charity, and charity, he was learning, could be a form of violence to those with dignity. The solution came from an unexpected source: the old priest from the church. Arthur went there early in the morning. He found the priest, a man named Father Michael, sweeping the entrance. Arthur, without identifying himself as the owner of the company that caused the eviction, explained that he was a businessman who had learned of the family's situation and wanted to help anonymously through the church. He proposed that the priest be the intermediary. The church would offer the temporary apartment, funded by an anonymous benefactor, and the medical appointment as part of a parish assistance program. Father Michael, a man who had seen enough of human nature to be skeptical, looked at Arthur with shrewd eyes. He saw the expensive suit, the gold watch, but he also saw the exhaustion and genuine desperation in the rich man's eyes. "Goodness has many faces, my son," the priest said softly, "and sometimes it wears the face of regret. I will help you. For the family. They need a miracle." With the plan in motion, Arthur felt slightly less useless, but the anxiety didn't leave him. He waited in his car at a discreet distance while the priest spoke with Elvira. He watched the conversation, the old woman's initial hesitation, the stubbornness in her face. He saw Leah beside her, listening intently, her large, serious eyes weighing the priest's words. Finally, to his immense relief, he saw Elvira nod, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. Her acceptance came not from resignation, but from a desperate love for her grandchildren. She would do anything to see Leo breathe better, even swallow her pride. The first victory was getting them to the doctor. Arthur followed them to the upscale clinic, a world completely different from anything they knew. He sat in the waiting room, pretending to read a financial magazine while they were seen. He could hear Leo's frightened cries coming from the exam room and felt every sob as if it were his own. Leah emerged first, holding her brother's hand, who now had a small superhero sticker on his arm. She saw him. This time, there was no doubt. Their eyes met across the waiting room. There was confusion in her gaze, an unasked question. Why was that man, the same one from the street with the money, here? Arthur simply nodded his head, a minimal gesture of acknowledgement. He felt his face grow warm, caught in his own web of secrets. Later, the doctor, who had been generously compensated, found Arthur in the hallway. "The boy has severe asthma, complicated by a respiratory infection," the doctor said. "The conditions they were living in were poison for him. He needs ongoing treatment, medication, and above all, a clean, dry environment. A few more weeks in those conditions, I don't even want to think about it." The doctor's words were a sentence. Arthur realized the line between life and neglect was far thinner than he had ever imagined. This apartment couldn't be temporary. This help couldn't be a one-time thing. He was involved now, in a way that went far beyond a simple charitable investment. He had bought a building and, without knowing it, had taken responsibility for 3 lives. The move to the apartment was a bittersweet moment. Arthur watched from his car, parked across the street, as Father Michael helped them out of a taxi. The apartment was simple, but clean and sunny, in a safe building with a small playground out front. Leo, clutching a new inhaler as if it were a treasure, looked at the swings with wide eyes, a glimpse of the healthy child hidden beneath the illness. Elvira, moving with difficulty, cried silently upon seeing a real kitchen and beds with clean mattresses. Leah, however, remained quiet. She explored each room with an adult's seriousness, touching the furniture, looking out the window. Her joy was restrained, mixed with a suspicion that Arthur perfectly understood. It was too good to be true. And where did it all come from? The story of the church's anonymous benefactor was a thin veil for a mystery she, with her sharp intelligence, surely sensed. In the following days, Arthur continued his remote operation. He arranged for groceries to be delivered weekly, for Leo's prescriptions to be filled and paid for directly by the pharmacy, and for a discreet fund to be created at the parish to cover the utility bills. He was building a safety net for them, using his capital and influence in a way he never had before. It wasn't to generate profit or dividends, it was to generate stability, to generate easy breaths for a 5-year-old boy. However, the emotional chasm between him and the family remained. He saw them at the playground. He saw Leo's health improve daily, his cough giving way to laughter. He saw Elvira's shoulders relax a bit, the weight of the world slightly lifted. But he was a stranger, a phantom benefactor whose identity was a secret. The subplot of his professional life continued to unfold, forcing him to confront the person he was. Inspired, or perhaps shamed, by Elvira's dignity, he began to change how he treated his employees. He started asking about their families, listening to their ideas, seeing the names behind the numbers on his spreadsheets. The change was met with suspicion at first. His executives wondered what the new game was, the new manipulative strategy, but slowly, as they saw the consistency of his new behavior, the distrust began to give way to a cautious respect. He discovered that his employees were not just cogs in his money-making machine. They were people with their own dramas, dreams, and fears. For the first time, his vast business began to feel less like an empire and more like a community. The need to get closer to Leah and her family became unbearable. The charade of the anonymous benefactor was safe, but it was empty. He wanted to see Leo's smile up close, wanted to hear Elvira's voice without the filter of distance, wanted to understand what was going on in Leah's quiet, observant mind. The opportunity arose in an unexpected way. Father Michael called him, "Elvira is worried," the priest said. "She's grateful, but she feels useless. She wants to contribute to work, but her health won't allow it. And Leah, the girl hasn't been to school in 2 years. She needs an education, a routine to be a child." School. It was the key. Arthur knew he couldn't just enroll her. That would reveal his hand. He needed an excuse, a reason to be in their lives legitimately. And then he had an idea that was both terrifying and exciting. He would introduce himself not as a savior, but as someone who also needed help. He remembered how Leah cared for her brother, her patience and maturity. The excuse was fragile, almost transparent, but it was the only one he had. He would go to their apartment, knock on the door, and ask Elvira for permission to hire Leah for a few hours a week for a simple task, to help him organize the children's books in his home library, which he was preparing for a donation. He would offer her a fair wage, a formal contract through the church. It would be a job, not charity, and it would be his only bridge across the chasm. The drive to the apartment building felt longer and more intimidating than any trip to a billion-dollar negotiation meeting. Arthur rehearsed what he would say, but every sentence sounded false, calculated. The truth was, there was no script for what he was about to do. He was acting on impulse, an instinct he had spent his entire life suppressing. He knocked on the door, his hand trembling slightly. Leah opened it. Her eyes widened in instant recognition, and she took a step back, as if to protect what was inside. "Hello, Leah," Arthur said, his voice softer than usual. "Is your grandmother home?" Elvira appeared behind her, leaning on a cane Arthur had anonymously provided. The suspicion on her face was an almost physical barrier. "Yes," she said, her voice frail but firm. Arthur explained his proposal. The story about the library and the donation. He spoke of how he had noticed Leah's responsibility and care, and how he needed someone trustworthy for the task. He emphasized that it would be a paid job, with flexible hours that wouldn't interfere with school once she was re-enrolled. Elvira listened in silence, her sharp gaze shifting between Arthur and Leah. She saw the expensive suit and the posture of power, but she also noticed the restrained nervousness, the wavering sincerity in his eyes. She was a woman life had taught to read people, not their words. She looked at her granddaughter, who was watching Arthur with an intensity that surprised her. Leah didn't look scared, but curious, analytical. "Why us?" Elvira asked, the question laden with a deeper meaning. Arthur took a deep breath. The lie was fragile, and he knew it. He opted for a version of the truth. "Because your granddaughter," he said, looking directly at Leah, "showed me what honesty means, on a day when I didn't expect to find it, and I would like to repay that lesson with an opportunity." The simplicity of the answer seemed to break Elvira's resistance. She saw the man from the street, the man with the fallen money, and the pieces began to fit. She didn't understand everything, but she understood enough. She nodded slowly. But I'm coming with her the first time." The first visit to Arthur's home was a culture shock. The penthouse was a palace of glass and marble overlooking the entire city. Leo, who had come along, stood frozen in the middle of the living room, looking up, down, and all around as if he had entered another planet. Leah, however, seemed unimpressed by the opulence. She walked through the vast library, running her fingers along the spines of the books with a quiet reverence. The work began. Arthur showed her the shelves of children's books, many of them untouched, bought by a decorator. The task was simple: sort them by age and clean them. As they worked, an awkward silence hung in the air. Arthur tried to make small talk, but his attempts were clumsy. He was used to giving orders, not chatting with an 8-year-old girl. The barrier was broken by Leo. Bored with the books, he began to explore and found an old set of wooden building blocks that had belonged to Arthur as a child, stored in a chest. He started to build a tower, which inevitably collapsed. Frustrated, he began to cry. Before Arthur could react, Leah was beside her brother, kneeling on the expensive floor. "No, Leo, look," she said patiently, "you need a strong foundation. If the foundation isn't strong, everything falls apart." She took the larger blocks and began to build a solid base, explaining each step to her little brother. Arthur watched, fascinated. She wasn't just talking about wooden blocks. In that simple sentence, "If the foundation isn't strong, everything falls apart," she had summarized the fragility of their lives and Arthur's own failure. His life, his empire, his wealth. It had all been built on a foundation of isolation and mistrust. A weak foundation, and it was starting to fall apart. Gradually, the visits became a routine. Elvira, seeing that Arthur was harmless, stopped coming with them. It was just Arthur, Leah, and Leo in the vast, silent penthouse. Leah worked with a quiet diligence, but her eyes observed everything. She asked questions, not about the money or the wealth, but about the books. "Have you read this one?" she would ask, holding up a book of fairy tales. Arthur, who hadn't read fiction in decades, would admit that he hadn't. Then she would ask him to read to her and Leo, and he would read. His voice, accustomed to dictating memos and closing deals, softened as he narrated stories of dragons and princesses. In those moments, sitting on the library floor with two children he had pulled from misery, Arthur felt a peace that no successful transaction had ever given him. But the secret of his identity as the anonymous benefactor, and worse, as the cause of their eviction, was a constant weight on his chest. He was building a connection based on a lie, and he knew, with the certainty of an investor predicting a market crash, that if the foundation isn't strong, everything falls apart. He just didn't know when the collapse would come. The weeks turned into a month, and the library became a sanctuary. The routine of afternoons spent reading and organizing books created an unexpected and fragile bond between the billionaire and the children. Arthur discovered a patience in himself he never knew he possessed. Teaching Leo to write his name and listening to Leah read aloud, her pronunciation improving every day, he enrolled her in an excellent private school, using the same scholarship from a church program, Facade, and secretly delighted in her excited reports about her classes and new friends. He was living a double life, the ruthless shark in his office by day and an almost fatherly figure in the afternoon. The lie, however, grew along with the affection. Every smile from Leah, every spontaneous hug from Leo was both a joy and a stab to his conscience. He was their guardian angel and their demon, all in one. The tension came to a head on a particularly cold afternoon. Leo, who had been improving visibly, woke up that morning with a high fever and the same wheezing cough Arthur had heard from outside the window weeks before. A relapse. Leah called the number Arthur had given her for work emergencies, her voice filled with controlled panic. "Uncle Arthur, Leo's not well. He's burning up and he can't breathe right. Grandma's nervous. She doesn't know what to do." The term Uncle Arthur hit him hard. He had become part of the family. Without hesitation, Arthur left an important meeting. "I'm on my way. Don't leave the apartment." He drove, breaking every speed limit, his heart hammering against his ribs. The fear he felt was primal, paternal. It was no longer about charity or repair. It was about Leo. He arrived at the apartment to find a scene of restrained desperation. Elvira was beside her grandson, praying softly, her hands trembling. Leah was trying to calm her brother, who was crying. Frightened by his own struggle to breathe, the inhaler didn't seem to be working. Arthur acted with the decisiveness of a CEO in a crisis. "We're going to the hospital now." He scooped Leo up into his arms. The boy was as light as a feather, his small body hot against his. The trust with which Leo snuggled into his chest, seeking safety, almost undid him. At the hospital, the efficiency that money could buy kicked in. They were taken immediately to the pediatric emergency room. Doctors and nurses surrounded Leo, hooking him up to monitors and an oxygen mask. Arthur, Leah, and Elvira were left in a sterile waiting room, the silence broken only by the distant beeping of machines. The hours dragged on. Elvira fell asleep in a chair, exhausted by the stress. Leah sat next to Arthur, as rigid as a statue. She wasn't crying, but her eyes were fixed on the door through which they had taken her brother. "It's my fault," she whispered suddenly, her voice choked. "I should have noticed sooner. I should have made him wear his coat at the playground yesterday." Arthur turned to her, his heart breaking at her self-blame. "No, Leah, it's not your fault," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're the best sister anyone could ever wish for. You did everything you could." She shook her head, the tears finally streaming down. It wasn't enough. It's never enough. In that moment, seeing her despair, Arthur knew he could no longer uphold the lie. The foundation had to be revealed, even if it meant everything would collapse. "Leah," he began, his voice low and heavy, "there's something I have to tell you about the apartment. The doctor. About everything. It's not the church. It's me. Leah raised her red-rimmed eyes to him, confusion mixing with her pain. And there's more, Arthur continued, the confessions spilling out like poison. The building where you used to live, the reason you were evicted, that was me too. My company bought that place. The silence that followed was the loudest Arthur had ever experienced. The color drained from Leah's face. Confusion gave way to a slow, horrifying understanding. Pain morphed into betrayal. She looked at him as if he were a monster, one she had invited into her home, into her life, one her brother had hugged. She rose slowly, backing away from him as if he were on fire. "You," she whispered, the word thick with disbelief and revulsion. "You did that to us? And then, why?" The question hung in the air with no easy answer. The emergency room door opened, and a doctor appeared, his face serious, but Arthur barely noticed him. His entire world was focused on Leah's face. On the moment, his castle of lies finally crumbled, and he was about to lose. The only thing he had discovered truly mattered. The doctor approached, his expression a mixture of professionalism and fatigue. "Leonardo's family?" he asked. Arthur stood up, but it was Leah who answered, her voice small but surprisingly strong. "That's us." Her eyes never left Arthur's face, and her gaze was an indictment no court of law could ever match. "Leo is stable," the doctor said, oblivious to the drama unfolding. It was an acute crisis, likely triggered by a virus, but the medication is working. He'll need to be under observation for a few days, but the worst is over. He's a tough kid. The news of Leo's recovery should have been pure relief, a victory. For Arthur, it was merely a stay of his sentence. He had saved the boy's life, but destroyed his sister's trust. He looked at Elvira, who had woken at the doctor's arrival and was listening to the diagnosis with tears of gratitude. She didn't yet know of Arthur's confession, but he could see the storm gathering in Leah's eyes. When the doctor moved away, Leah turned to her grandmother. "Grandma," she said, her voice trembling. "Uncle Arthur, he—" She couldn't finish. The words were too heavy. Elvira looked from her granddaughter to Arthur, the confusion on her face turning to apprehension. It was Arthur who spoke, accepting his fate. "Elvira," he said, his voice devoid of all arrogance, "what Leah is trying to tell you is the truth. It was me. My company was responsible for your eviction and all the help you've received. The apartment, the doctors. It came from me. I'm so sorry. I know nothing I say can fix this, but I needed you to know." The revelation hung in the sterile waiting room. Elvira leaned more heavily on her cane, her body seeming to shrink. The gratitude on her face was replaced by a complex expression of pain, wounded pride, and profound disillusionment. She had accepted charity from the church, an act of God, but to learn it was charity from the man who had taken her home was a deep humiliation. "Why?" she finally asked, the same question as Leah, but with the weight of a lifetime of struggle. Arthur offered no excuses or justifications. He gave them the raw truth. "At first, it was guilt. I saw what my negligence had caused, and I wanted to fix it. I didn't know about you, not personally. You were just a number on an acquisition report. Later, after I met Leah, and then you, the guilt turned into something else, into responsibility, into caring. I hid the truth because I was afraid you wouldn't accept the help if you knew it came from me, afraid of losing. This," he gestured vaguely between them, referring to the fragile connection they had built. Leah, who had remained silent, took a step forward. Her tears had dried, leaving a cold clarity behind. "You lied," she said, each word a tiny shard of ice. "You made us like you. You read stories to Leo. You gave us a home, but it was a home built on a lie." Arthur didn't defend himself. "Yes," he admitted, "I lied, and it was wrong. The only thing that wasn't a lie, Leah, was how much I grew to care about you all. He looked at Elvira. I don't ask for your forgiveness because I don't think I deserve it. I only ask that you don't punish Leo for my mistakes. Let me continue to ensure he gets the treatment he needs. Let me continue to ensure you have a safe place to live. You can hate me. You have every right. But please don't refuse the help because of the messenger. He handed Elvira a card with his lawyer's name and number. This man will handle everything. A trust has been established in the children's names. It will guarantee their education, their health, and their well-being, no matter what happens to me or my business. It is legally theirs. I can't touch it anymore. It's an inheritance. He then turned and walked toward the hospital exit, each step feeling like it weighed a ton. He had done all he could. He had confessed, made financial amends, and now he was walking away, leaving the final decision in their hands. As he reached the door, he heard Leah's voice call out, "Uncle Arthur!" He stopped but didn't turn around, afraid to see the hatred in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice low, almost inaudible, "for saving Leo again." The "thank you" was wrapped in pain and confusion, but it wasn't the condemnation he expected. It was something far more complicated. It was a beginning. Leah's thank you echoed in Arthur's mind for days, a solitary note of hope in a symphony of guilt. He stayed away, as promised, giving the family the space they needed to process the truth. The silence was torture. The penthouse, once a symbol of his success, now felt like an empty, silent prison. The library, in particular, was a haunting place. The children's books, now perfectly organized, were a testament to the connection he feared he had lost forever. He continued to transform his company, implementing more humane policies, creating a corporate foundation to help homeless families, turning the pain of his mistake into a constructive purpose. His employees, seeing the genuine change, began to look at him no longer with fear, but with a newfound respect. He was rebuilding his foundation, brick by brick. About a week later, he received a phone call. It was Elvira. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, her voice formal but without the coldness he expected. "We would like to invite you over for coffee. We need to talk." Arthur's heart leaped. He accepted, humility replacing his old arrogance. He went to their apartment that afternoon. The place looked more like a home now, with Leo's drawings taped to the refrigerator and a vase of wildflowers on the coffee table. Leah and Leo sat on the couch, and Elvira served him a cup of coffee in a simple mug. The silence was broken by her, "We've talked a lot, Leah and I," the old woman began. "What you did was wrong. The lie hurt us deeply." Arthur nodded, accepting the words. "But," she continued, "we also looked at what you did right. You saved my grandson's life. Twice you gave us a safe home, and you gave my granddaughter the chance to dream again." She looked at Leah, who slid off the couch and approached Arthur. She was holding one of the fairy tale books from his library. "I understand why you lied," the girl said, her wisdom far beyond her years. "You thought we wouldn't accept it, and maybe Grandma wouldn't have." She gave a small smile to her grandmother, who returned it. "But you could have told the truth. We would have understood. We always understand the hard things." She held the book out to him. "Leo misses your stories." It was the simplest and most profound peace offering Arthur had ever received. The tears he had held back for weeks finally came, and he made no effort to hide them. He took the book, and with a choked voice, he sat on the floor and began to read. 5 weeks after that chance encounter on the street, everyone's life had transformed in unrecognizable ways. Elvira, with her health stabilized and her peace of mind restored, passed away peacefully in her sleep a few years later, knowing her grandchildren were safe. Before then, she and Arthur had developed a mutual respect, and she made him promise to look after the children. He kept that promise, becoming Leah and Leo's legal guardian, giving them not only financial security, but a home filled with love and support. The boy, once frail and sick, made a full recovery, his laughter echoing through the once silent halls of the penthouse. Leah, the girl who returned a fortune out of integrity, blossomed in school, her intelligence and compassion making her stand out. She never lost the seriousness in her eyes, but it was now balanced with the carefree joy of childhood. Arthur Blackwell was no longer the same man. He discovered that true wealth was not in accumulating assets, but in distributing kindness. His social projects expanded, and his company became a model of corporate responsibility. The most profound change, however, was internal. The armor of coldness had melted away, revealing a man capable of vulnerability, connection, and a deep, protective love for two children who had come into his life by chance. The story ended not with a grand gesture, but with an everyday scene. Arthur was in his library, now a vibrant, lively space, helping Leo with his homework, while Leah, a little older, read in a nearby armchair. He looked at them. The legacy of his greatest mistake and his greatest redemption. The street that had witnessed his fall had become a symbol of how a single act of honesty, from the most unexpected of places, could trigger a revolution of kindness. Arthur Blackwell had learned that vulnerability was not a weakness, but the only doorway to genuine happiness, and that the greatest treasures, the true jewels of a life, are not bought with money, but found in the courage to open one's heart.